So I'll get started. I want to say welcome to everybody to this third in a series of educational forums that have been developed and are being presented by the League of Women Voters, Davis area. The forum tonight is entitled The Housing Element, What is it and How does it affect us? So I'll be your moderator. My name's Georgina Valencia. I am one of the founding members and on the board for the League of Women Voters. And our board is made up of Mary Jo Bryan, who's our president, Bob Fung, who is our vice president, Omo Hawk, who's our director at large, and Judy Higgerson, who's our membership services director. So I'm going to do a little bit of an unabashed ad first before we roll into things, and that is the event tonight and previous events are possible because of our membership, our league members. Your membership and your donations, and of course our team of volunteers make things like this event tonight and things we've done in the past possible. For those of you that are members already, we ask that you will renew your membership. And we'll be sending out renewals here in the next week to 10 days. And those that aren't members will help us continue to do this and other events that we've got coming up by either making a donation or being a member of the League. The League is going to be sponsoring a number of candidate forums this year, city council seats, school board seats, board of supervisors, a rerun. And we're also working with Jesse Salinas's office, who's our Yolo County registrar, and working on the upcoming general elections. So as we like to say in the League, help us make democracy work, okay? So now, turning our attention to tonight. So why this forum on the housing element? Well, our general plan and our housing element are due to be updated by state mandate. The updates have to occur every 10 years, and ours is due May 2021, which in policy terms is not all that long a distance out in front of us. But what is a housing element? Well, our speakers tonight are the professionals. I'm going to let them define it for you, but let me offer a thought. Some might say that a housing element and the corresponding housing policies for a community are really a reflection of that community's values. And, you know, things like, does our community feel it's important to find solutions for homelessness? Or is rental housing needed for our community workforce? A community workforce is made up of people that fix our cars, service in the restaurants, cut our hair. Or is it important to help maybe young people, maybe a school teacher, someone to help them buy their first home so they can live in the community they work in. These are all real issues and they're all considerations while we listen to our speakers tonight. So let's get started. I'll introduce each speaker. They'll have 15 minutes to make their presentation. Then we'll have, once everybody's presented, we'll have some dialogue on, amongst our speakers on the panel. And then we'll also be looking to the questions from our audience, and I'll pose the questions to the panel for you. So our first speaker is Greg Chu. He's the senior planner for SACOG, and SACOG stands for Sacramento Area Council of Government. And Greg will be focusing on what we call RHNA numbers, and those are the Regional Housing Allocation Numbers. Greg has an extensive background in urban planning. He specializes in the implementation and funding of smart growth principles, airport and land use compatibility, housing policy, and public participation. So he could really help us tonight. Additionally, Greg is a member and former chair for Mutual Housing California. Mutual Housing is a nonprofit affordable housing organization that's provided over 1,000 units of housing for low-income households. So, Greg, without further ado, you're on.
Okay, well, thank you for having me tonight. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
No, okay, thanks. Let me share my screen. And we'll get going here. Can you see that? Thumbs up? Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. So tonight the main topic is the Davis housing element and what a housing element is and what it means to the Davis community. But before we can get to that, we want to talk about kind of the parts of the state law, what the state housing law is, how that affects what's called the regional housing needs allocation process, and then how that affects the housing element. That will give you context for our next speaker, Jessica Lynch from the city of Davis. So first of all, if you're not familiar with SACOG, advance my slide. If you're not familiar with SACOG, again, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, we're a 6-county regional government based in downtown Sacramento. We serve the 2.4 million residents of the 6-county areas. So those are Yolo County, Sacramento County, Sutter and Yuba counties, Placer and El Dorado counties. 22 cities and 6 counties. We are the regional transportation planning organization for the 6 counties, and we serve the 22 cities and 6 counties in the area. That's our main purpose. Our board is comprised of elected officials, one from each of the 22 cities and 6 counties, and our main purpose is transportation planning and managing state and federal transportation funds to distribute to the cities and counties. So let me go to the housing element law, the housing law in general. So it's been in effect since the 1970s. The issue is California has always struggled to produce enough housing relative to the demand that we have. This chart here, can you see my, my mouse?
Yes.
So this chart here shows kind of the degree of production that the state has had collectively, so for the entire state. And here in the last 30 years, since the 1990s, we've been underproducing relative to historical production. And we need about 180,000, which is where my mouse is pointing to. That would be the line for 180,000 units of housing. That's just for the natural growth that we have. Statewide, the state of California did a survey, and it projected that we're between 3 and 3.5 million units of housing short for what our existing need is right now. That's a deficit greater than the other 49 states put together. And because of that, housing has had an increased emphasis at the state legislature, even though this law has been in effect for some time. So let me just talk about what the law is. I'm here to talk about the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, or RHNA. Basically, it's state law that wants to ensure that we zone enough land to accommodate all levels, all economic segments of our communities in each city and county throughout the state. It basically, jurisdictions have one power, which is the power of, when it comes to planning, is zoning ability. So the state law does not require the jurisdiction to build the housing or to have the housing built, but to do its part to ensure that we have enough zone land to accommodate the projected need that each jurisdiction has. That's really important because the jurisdictions don't have the ability to force a landowner to build housing, but it does have the ability to zone enough housing. And when we talk about all economic segments, we'll get to that in just a second, but there's different types of zoning depending on which segment that we're looking for. Here's a simplified version of what the RHNA is and how it affects the housing element. So basically every 8 years, the RHNA process, the RHNA cycle, it starts with the state of California. The Department of Finance tries to project how much growth is going to happen in a region during an 8-year period of time. In the upcoming RHNA cycle, which is from 2021 to 2029, the state does its analysis. It looks at birth rates, death rates, job growth, and a bunch of other factors. And it tells our region how many units of housing that we're going to grow by in that 8-year period of time. SACOG does our own projections for other reasons. We mainly do it for transportation planning purposes. And we work with all the jurisdictions to get a good sense for how much it's going to grow by, what it's projecting, how realistic does it have the water rights and the land and so forth. So we do our own projections in parallel to the state. The state provides us a overall number, plus they break down that overall number into 4 income categories. So the RHNA process is the part that is highlighted by this box here. Our board spent, and the Council of Governments spent the last year and a half working on that to develop the formula. The RHNA process is basically the formula by which we take the overall number that's given to the region and then to come up with a formula to divide that up to the 22 cities and 6 counties in our region. From there, once those numbers are adopted, and they were finally adopted after the year and a half process in March of this year, once those numbers are adopted, then each jurisdiction receives its allocation. And I'll show you what Davis's is in just a moment. From there, the jurisdictions with their allocation come up with a housing element, which is basically a chapter of the general plan that is, it's the only one that's required, and it's required to be updated periodically with each RHNA cycle. The housing element basically addresses how the jurisdiction is going to zone enough land to meet the projected demand that comes out of the RHNA formula for each jurisdiction. It has to come up with, it has to show where specific potential parcels are that would accommodate the housing, and it has to run it by the state. Jessica will cover more of that in her presentation. So what's in the formula? There's a state mandate on what sort of objectives we have to do. So really quickly, first of all, we have to increase the supply in different types of housing. By different types, we're talking not just single family, but we're talking apartments, duplexes, different varieties of housing to meet the different needs that are out there for the projected demand. In addition, we want to promote infill, equity, and environment. Those are all state planning goals. The 2 in blue are ones that have been in place for quite a while. The 3 here in red are added objectives that the state has added in the last few years. There's been a lot of housing legislation in the last 3 years. Jessica's going to touch on some of those, but so our formula has to look at balancing the jobs and housing, particularly by income wage. So for communities that have a lot of low wage jobs, there should be some proportionality to how much lower cost housing there is. In addition, we're looking at regional income parity. One of the things that we're trying to do is to not concentrate lower income housing in certain clusters, but to have some sort of parity throughout the region from all the jurisdictions. And the last thing is very similar. This comes from the federal government, the analysis of impediments to fair housing. Make sure we don't cluster either different ethnic or racial groups together or income categories together, and try to spread them out and to look for ways to provide fair housing across this region. So what happens with this formula? The formula comes to SACOG. Again, our board spent 14 meetings discussing it, going over it. I'm not going to talk about the formula at all tonight. If you are interested in that, you can go to the sacog.org website. There's a lot of information about that. But again, we spent a year and a half to get to that point, to a formula that our board unanimously approved. But each jurisdiction gets 5 numbers. The first one is the total allocation of units. That's the total number of housing units it has to address. And then it's broken out into 4 income categories. So the very low income category means a household that makes less than 50% of the area median income for a county would fall into that category. So in Yolo County, the area median income for a family of 4 is $85,000. So if you're a household that makes less than $42,000, you would fall into the very low income category. The low income category is between 50 and 80% of area median family income. moderate 80 to 120%, and above moderate is 120% plus. So each jurisdiction receives an allocation for each of those that comprises the total numbers. So this is probably the most, the part that has the most interest to most jurisdictions and most elected officials is this part. The very low and low combined are what we call the affordable housing units. These two numbers combined are the amount of units that a jurisdiction needs to zone multifamily or deed restricted affordable. So multifamily higher density, meaning for most jurisdictions, that's 30 units to the acre, unless you get a waiver with the state showing that your jurisdiction quite can't do that. So that's gonna be very important when Jessica gets to her part. So here's the numbers for the city of Davis. 580 units of very low, 350 for low, and so forth. Total amount of units is 2,075. And of that, about 44% of them are in the affordable category, the low and very low income categories, 930 units. So that's about 44%. As a region, the amount of affordable housing units that we received is over 40% as a whole. So how does Davis compare to other jurisdictions, just to give you some idea? It's got just over 2,000 units, and of which 930 are affordable. City of West Sacramento. West Sacramento has about 53,000 people, and it received 4 times the amount of affordable units and more than that in terms of total units. The City of Sacramento got 16,000, almost 17,000 affordable units and 45,000, almost 46,000 total units. And for a broader perspective, comparing last cycle to this cycle, this is an 8-year cycle. So we're just at the end of the one that ends in 2021. Davis got just over 1,000 units, and it's getting over 2,000 units this cycle. So it's almost a 95% increase. For our region as a whole, we went from 105,000 units to 153,000 units as a whole. That's a 46% increase from last cycle. And just to give some perspective on what's going on, state legislature changed how the formula works and how the number is to receive that each region would get. Just to give you some perspective, the LA region went from 400,000 units in the last RHNA cycle to 1.3 million units. That's more than a triple of what they got. So the legislature has really focused in on wanting more housing zoned in the state, as you can see by these numbers here, and that's reflected for every jurisdiction in the region. So finally, this is the last slide. So the city's received its numbers, as you saw. Jessica will talk about how that's going to, how the city plans to address its housing element. But the question is, what happens if you don't make your housing element? What happens if a city chooses not to provide a compliant housing element or chooses not to do a housing element at all? And this is something the legislature keeps bringing up. What about the non-compliant jurisdictions? So in the state of California, there's about more than 500 cities and counties in the state. About 10% of them, about 50 of them are out of compliance. All the other jurisdictions have made quite the effort to have a compliant housing element. So what happens if you don't? Jurisdiction doesn't make it. First of all, there's a lot of monies with the state legislature right now has had a lot of both penalties as well as carrots for jurisdictions to do well with housing. So right now there's a lot of housing funds that have never been available for jurisdictions to do the planning and do what's necessary to help them promote the production of housing. Second of all, if a jurisdiction doesn't make its housing element, it is subject to lawsuit by affected parties, and there's lots of different case studies around the state about that. With that, if you don't have a housing element, you go from an 8-year cycle to a 4-year cycle, meaning you'd have to come up with a housing element every 4 years. Housing elements are very expensive to perform. Any missing units that isn't in the housing cycle will be added on to the next cycle. So if a jurisdiction can't make it just yet, whatever it has a deficit, it gets tacked on to the next cycle. And finally, a state can impose financial penalties on a weekly or daily basis for non-compliance. So with all that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica. Feel free to contact me at this website. A lot of the things about RHNA, which I could not cover in this time, you can go to the SACOG website.
We'll have a few questions for you when we do the panel discussion, Greg, so stay with us, okay? So let me introduce Jessica. Jessica is the senior planner for the City of Davis, and she's newly appointed, and we're very excited to have her join us this evening. Jessica will focus on governmental requirements for housing, and she has been working, her background is in urban environmental planning. She's been in that arena for 15 years. She has a passion for assisting local governments in developing policies to manage land use, housing, urban growth, and infrastructure. Jessica was most recently with the County of Sacramento, performing long-range planning on work of master plans. And she's also going to be doing or managing the outreach to our community for the general plan update and the housing element. And your registration to this event tonight will pass those names on to Jessica. So you'll be in the queue, if you will. All right, Jessica, you're on.
Yes, well, thank you for having me, Georgina, and everyone. Sorry, I've got a little one, so hopefully it's not too much noise. But she's been quiet until now. But yeah, like Georgina said, my name is Jessica Lynch. I am new to the city. I just started in January, and now I've actually been sheltering in place for more than half of the time that I've worked for the city. So that's been an interesting challenge, trying to get to know the lay of the land while working from home and trying to get to know everybody. But everybody's been very nice. So thank you very much for welcoming me. Like Georgina said, I'm going to be managing the housing element. I have worked on a few housing elements as a consultant in the past in various areas of the state. But I've never managed one for the city, for a city or county before. So this will be a lot of fun. So I have a presentation prepared. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll see if the technology works. Let's see if I can find it here. Here we go. All right. So, oops, where is it? There we go. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. Okay, can everybody see that?
Good.
Okay, so I'm going to, Greg provided me with a great lead-in, providing a little bit of background and context for what's going on in the City of Davis. We are now just kicking off our housing element update for the 2021 to 2029 period. Like Greg mentioned, we worked with SACOG for a while to try to figure out what the numbers of that RHNA, the share of land that we as a jurisdiction are responsible for in order to do our part to provide housing for the region. Okay, so first I wanted to talk a little bit about what is affordable housing, because there are multiple definitions of affordable housing. Greg got at this a little bit. When we talk about affordable housing generally in governmental terms, we're generally talking about subsidized housing. It tends to be smaller at higher densities. The state default for metropolitan areas is generally 30 units per acre. The rental prices are generally based on subsidies that are received by that housing manager for some sort of, based on some subsidy that they receive from the government in some way. There are usually deed restrictions that require long-term affordability, and those deed restrictions are enforced through development agreements. It could be covenants on the deeds of the properties, and we monitor those. Usually a city, a housing authority will monitor those on an annual basis, and we report that to the state. So when those properties begin to come to the end of their deed restricted periods, we can go in and sometimes we'll work with them to see if they can continue to be deed restricted and provide housing for for lower income people. Renters must meet the income qualifications. Greg shared the list of what it means to be a very low income household, what it means to be a low income household, et cetera. And I already mentioned the affordability is monitored and reported on. Also, what we try to get at is that there's also this affordable by design concept, and that is housing that's just affordable because it tends to be smaller, it's not as fancy. Those are things that just by the nature of the economy are just more affordable than like a large house, a single family home. So those tend to be just smaller units, micro units, studios, multi-family units, accessory housing dwelling units, or we call them granny flats, that sort of thing, and tiny homes. Again, this is a little bit of a repeat of what Greg provided for the 2021 to 2029 period. The RHNA for the region is over 153,000 units. Of that, Davis is being asked to provide zoning for 2,075 units at all income levels. That includes 930 or 44.8% of those units as low income or below. That is based on zoning capacity. The year here is 2024 because we just have to have a plan. We don't necessarily have to have the zoning in place by the time the housing element is adopted. We have a little bit of a grace period to get that plan in order and make that happen. But we do need to have a good idea of how we're going to make that happen. We're going to get enough land to provide for enough housing. And it tends to be that it's primarily a struggle in California to provide enough land for lower income units, simply because it's much easier. There are better profits in development of the traditional single family housing. So those kind of things just kind of work themselves out, and it's not as much of a challenge in a community like Davis to provide for those types of housing. Developers just do that on their own, but the multifamily is where we actually run into it's a lot more difficult to get that in place. So that tends to be where our focus is. That doesn't mean that we're not monitoring the moderate and above moderate housing units that go in and making sure that we have enough land. It's just, in general, we have enough land for that right now. What is the city's responsibility? It is the city's, and I think Greg had mentioned this, the city does not develop the housing. We can't control what property owners do with their properties. We can't tell people to build apartments on their property. However, what we can do is try to get enough land zoned for multifamily residential to accommodate our portion, our allocation of that very low and low income units that the state is asking us to provide for. And so that'll be our focus. And then when people are interested in developing affordable housing, the city will work with them and we'll try to connect them with the resources, connect them to finances, and kind of help them through that process, because it is something that we recognize as a need. We are expected as a city to plan to meet the existing and projected housing needs of our community. We look at the demographic numbers, we look at we try to figure out what is the population that is going to naturally be growing, how many people are going to be coming in, what types of people are going to expected to come into our city, and we have to provide housing for them. Or we have to make sure that there's enough land to provide housing for them, so that way the market can kind of take over and housing can just be built. Part of our process, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, we identify and do what we can to remove the constraints to housing analysis, or excuse me, housing development. And we gain state certification every 8 years through the housing element update process. And then we review it every year and report to the state on what our progress is. Are we meeting our goals? Are we doing what we need to do to make sure that our plan comes to fruition? So wanted to talk a little bit about our annual progress report that we provide to the California Department of Housing and Community Development. We also provide it to the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. It's generally due every year by April 1st. However, this year is special because of COVID and shelter at home orders. We're behind on this, but it's okay. We're in good standing with the state. This is actually something we should be bringing, we're hoping to bring to the City Council next week on, let's see, June 2nd. We're hoping to talk about this and provide our findings on this report. But the state asks us to report to them these things that are listed here. And that's the number of building permits that we issued in the prior calendar year, the number of entitlements that were approved for and applied for. And if we've denied entitlements or denied projects, they want to know that as well. The types of housing that is built, or the types of housing that we issue entitlements and permits for, including single family, both detached and attached, multifamily, and ADUs. Now, ADUs are becoming quite the thing now. We report on the affordability level by income category, and we also report on the progress toward meeting our RHNA goals by income level. And just to give you a little bit of a preview, our current RHNA cycle, we are in the 7th of 8 years that we report. We were asked back in 2013 to provide for 1,066 units, including 248 for extremely low and very low income, 178 for low income, 198 for moderate income, and 446 for above moderate. So those numbers do kind of take into account that this is a higher income area. And just to let everyone know, as of December 31st of last year, we had already surpassed the requirements for the moderate income and the above moderate income housing. And we have 23 left in the low income category that we're being asked to provide for. And then 139 for the extremely low and very low income. So, which is pretty typical because those are the most challenging income levels to provide housing for. Let's see, so let me see here. Whoops, oh, sorry, whoopsie, went back. Guys got to see a little bit of a preview. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the required contents of a housing element plan. This is very simplified. As we go through the community outreach process, and I'm sure that a lot of you are going to be involved in that, we'll talk about this in more detail, but just to give us a quick overview of the basic things that we are asked to provide for in a housing element. These are the things that the state asks all jurisdictions to report on. They ask us to identify our community's existing and future housing needs, identify the special housing populations that affect the types of housing that are needed. Obviously, seniors need different types of housing, generally one stories. They might need more ADA type of units. Farm workers, we have to report on. Large families, people with, we report on the number of housing units that have 4 or more bedrooms, because large families obviously need more bedrooms and more space. People with disabilities, and not specific to what the state asks for, but here in Davis, because we have a special population of students, that's something that kind of drives our housing needs as well. So we report on that. That'll be the extra that we throw in there. We also identify the constraints to building housing. What is it that keeps housing from being able to be development, both governmental and non-governmental? The governmental constraints are the things that the city would have some sort of control over. And that would be permits, permit processing, permit fees, development impact fees, that sort of thing. And our land use, such as zoning and our general plan designations. So we can essentially have areas that are not zoned properly and would essentially kind of move out. That could be things like our development standards, our setbacks, our design standards, that sort of thing that could inadvertently or sometimes purposefully result in us not being able to build housing. There's also non-governmental constraints that the city can't necessarily do as much about, and that includes the cost of land, cost of construction, and availability of funding and financing. So part of these are actually some screenshots from the existing housing element, which I believe Danielle knows about this. I believe you worked on our last one, Danielle. So part of that is we identify appropriate land for housing. Where should we put a housing? You can see the map here. This is the map. Fortunately, Davis is small enough to where we can put it on a map where these are the sites that we said these would be great places to put housing. Something I've never seen before that I think is really interesting in Davis is that we prioritized the sites using a green, yellow, red, green sites being the highest priority for development, yellow being not as high priority, but when it's possible, let's do it. And then red, it would be, let's do that. That would be a great place for housing. Maybe not necessarily now, but it's not as high priority. So I think that that's a really, really cool idea to help us kind of focus where the housing should go. And as you can see from this map, there are some places that have had where we've done some work. The cannery comes to mind as some areas where we've put some housing since this last round. We're also working on the downtown Davis specific plan, and that is identified as a priority. Just the downtown plan and area, downtown area in general is listed as a priority area where we can put in some infill housing and kind of beef that up a little bit. We also have a list. We list each of the properties, where it's located, what it's currently designated and zoning for, and the income, or excuse me, the development potential of that site. How many units do we think we can put in that site? And that's how we track how many units we could potentially put within the city. I did want to, Greg kind of alluded to this a little bit, but as he mentioned, there's been a lot of change in the state legislation in housing in the past few years. So it's been a very interesting time to be a housing planner. In 2017, he had mentioned the added housing element objectives of improving the jobs housing balance, including income parity, and adding the analysis of impediments for fair housing. Those are part of this, what we call the 2017 housing package. In 2017, then Governor Brown approved 14 bills aimed at providing for more housing and increasing housing production. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but these are kind of the big picture items, and I'll let Greg and Danielle weigh in if they think that there's anything that I've missed, but these are the things that I think are important as a resident of Davis to understand. These are the things that have been added to the list of things that the cities and counties are required to do now. We had a bill in 2017 that streamlined the approval process for certain projects to make it easier to go through, and that includes less community input on those things. It included funding for housing planning, and that a lot of that is the funding that Greg mentioned earlier. So that is a great thing. Being asked to do a lot of additional work and having access to funds to do it with is very helpful. Increased enforcement. This is the legislation gave the state more ability to be able to I guess, come after cities and counties when they're not doing what they should be doing. And Greg mentioned there's been a few cases of that happening. There are financial penalties to cities and counties that deny affordable housing without a cause. So it's not to say that we have to approve it, but we have to have a very good reason and have to really justify that. And the onus is on us to do that. We have additional tracking responsibilities, a lot more stuff that we report to the state on an annual basis and that we put into our new housing elements. There's stronger restrictions on land that can be counted toward our allocations. We can't just put land out in the middle of nowhere and say, yeah, that's where we're going to put all the affordable housing, but it's not really developable. It has to have access to infrastructure and actually be a place that people could really actually put housing. And there's also this concept of no net loss. So if I were to have one of those housing sites in the previous map that I said would be a great place for multifamily housing, I can't just go and downzone it to single family without going through a process and replacing that multifamily housing that I was anticipating. If anyone is interested, the Department of Housing and Community Development has a really good summary of all of these bills. So if you want to know more about that, I put the website up here and I can send it to anybody that's interested, but that's a really great place where there's a good summary of all of those bills that happened. There's also the 2019 housing package, which kind of took a lot of us by surprise. That included 18 bills that were approved in September. Most notable of which, and I think that most people should be aware of, is SB 330, which further streamlines the approval process for housing. It also includes no net loss in zoning capacity, so it very much limits our ability to downzone properties, and it's actually retroactive to 2018. So that'll be interesting as we go through our general plan update. It puts limits on the fees that we can control. It also puts limits on local growth control measures. So it's more difficult for the city to put in a moratorium or to limit control. It also limits the number of hearings that we can have on a project to 5 hearings max, which will be very interesting as we move through our project, since we have a lot of commissions here and a lot of people want to know what's going on. So we can do a whole training just on that one. But we'll move on. We'll learn more about that as we go through the housing element process. We also, another bill created a surplus land inventory of lands that are owned by local governments. We also increased collection and reporting on housing data, the requirements for that. There is a bill that provides density bonuses for 100% affordable housing projects. So they're just allowed to do higher density. And then there are 5 different bills that are meant to encourage the development of accessory dwelling units. And we're in the process of trying to fix that. Danielle and I are actually working on a project together to an ADU toolkit, which I believe she's going to talk about. So I'll let her talk more about that. There is HCD doesn't have a nice fancy summary of the 2019 housing bills like they do for the 2017 bills, but the governor's office does have this website here that provides a summary. I just don't think it's as good as the other one. Okay, so this is my final slide. We are using this as an opportunity to kick off our community engagement for the housing element update. Community engagement is a required element of the housing element process, but it's also just really good common sense, because me sitting at a desk, I don't understand your community the way you do. And so we really rely on the residents and interested parties to tell us what's really going on and what's happening on the street and how they want to see their community come together. It can help us identify the issues and possible solutions to how we can provide for enough housing. I've provided a tentative timeline for the outreach schedule. This is very tentative. We're looking to hopefully kick everything off formally in June and July. We currently have a request for proposals out on the street right now for a consultant to help us with putting together all the data that needs to go into the housing element. So we're looking to hire that consultant, probably more like July. We'll be coordinating with the Social Services Commission. I just learned June 15th, I'll be there. I'll see you, Georgina.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll be doing that. And then we're looking to possibly create a housing element subcommittee later this summer. More information will be to come with that. We're going to be doing outreach meetings throughout from August or September all the way through May 2021. We're not sure exactly how many yet, but we are in the process of creating an outreach plan. And then we've got to get our draft housing element to HCD for them to review it. They have 60 days to review it, and then we have to get certified by May 2021. This is all going to be leading into hopefully comprehensive general plan update that we would like to use the housing element to kind of kick off. And I believe that Mike Webb talked with everyone about that last fall. So that we have some funding available to start that process. So we're hoping that this will kind of segue nicely into that. And with that, I put my my email information here, but I thank everyone and I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the panel.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica. That was terrific. All right, so we're going to move on to our next panelist. And for all those of you that are getting a little impatient, questions and answers, we'll have those at the end of all of the panelists' presentations, okay? So that way you'll get to know a little bit more about the material and our panelists. So next is Danielle Foster. Danielle is the housing manager for the city of Sacramento, and she'll be offering some examples of what Sacramento is doing and changes that they're making to facilitate, changes in zoning to facilitate affordable housing. Danielle has been in the affordable housing industry for over 18 years, and that includes 15 years with the city of Davis, so she knows all of our little quirks. Most recently, Danielle joined the city of Sacramento's team as their first housing policy manager. Over the last 6 months in this role, Ms. Foster has worked to support policies that streamline housing development and affordable housing initiatives, including use of city surplus properties, city housing bond framework, and plans to launch the accessory dwelling units, which we've had some questions about already. Currently, Ms. Foster is on a team of staff to work on affordable rehousing options for the expansion of nearly 1,000 shelter beds in Sacramento as a response to the COVID virus. And I'm happy to say that Danielle is an Aggie, okay? She got her bachelor's at UC Davis. Go Ags, woohoo! Me too, I'm an alumna too. All right, Danielle, you're on, it's your turn.
All right, thanks so much, and good evening, everybody. It's so nice to be with you tonight and be back with the Davis community here. And I just want to acknowledge the prior general plan and all the work that Bob Wolcott and I did together. And I know several of you on this call were definitely part of that process as well. So exciting to be going through that process again, and you're in good hands with Jessica. So I'm here to speak a little bit about what's going on regionally. I've had the good fortune of working in our Sacramento region for almost 20 years, as Georgina said, and seen a lot of shifts and gotten to be in different places and see what different communities are doing to respond to the needs for housing. It's a challenging and exciting time for housing right now, particularly in light of COVID-19. And as Georgina pointed out, there's definitely responses that we are doing specifically around COVID-19, but I think it's pushing us to think about creativity on a larger scale. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And I say that because there's a lot of things from COVID-19 that we've learned through this process that is going to apply for the long term, right? So we're looking at housing options so that we can provide shelter and housing units so that everyone can follow stay-at-home orders safely. And each community can reduce its carbon footprint. We've seen a lot of shifts in carbon over this stay-at-home order. And emissions. We are also looking at families and communities being able to connect more through the quality time being together rather than commuting from place to place. And then, of course, continuing to ensure equal access to services and education post-COVID. So within these areas, there's points where the city can play a role in the housing production. As Greg showed that statewide production map earlier, we haven't seen a lot of shifts in how housing is brought online over this past century. I mean, there were some new ideas with tract homes and things that happened post-war to get folks housed, but really, you know, stick-built has been consistently the way that we do affordable, or the way we build housing in general. So we're starting to shift and look at ways to be more in the process. In California, our markets are strong yet reactionary to economic shifts. And we have limited developable land that localities need to actively participate in planning and considering ways to incentivize the quantity and the types of housing needed. In order to increase housing production, cities are looking at areas key to construction where they have some control. These are things like certainty in the process, reducing costs of construction and process, creativity, how do we think outside the box and look towards other ways to build housing and bring it online more quickly and inexpensively, and looking at our processes through a customer service lens, and how do we create a process that eases all types of developers into housing production, including single family homeowners that want to do an accessory dwelling unit. So as we have all been discussing, the housing element process this round has some significant challenges, and not to belabor any of those because I think we've all touched on them, but just to broadly say, we have increased allocations, and a 46% increase that Greg mentioned. So we have more that we're trying to do post-recession and catching up with the needs of housing. There's definitely the strengthened oversight that's been mentioned by HCD, more tracking, more funding that requires certification. And we've even seen the state go through lawsuit processes to ensure that cities are complying with housing element requirements. There's also been additional laws, as pointed out, around no net loss, looking at sites that have been counted for the past 2 cycles and really thinking about whether they are developable. And then looking at things like the by right uses and fair housing thresholds and other impediments discussed. I also want to say, and if any of you have heard me talk before, this isn't unusual, I'm still grieving redevelopment. But I just want to say we have fewer resources for the development of affordable housing than we did in 2012 and prior with redevelopment agencies. So while we're trying to do more, we're doing more with less. And although under the current governor, we have seen an increase in state housing resources, we're still catching up to the levels that we used to have under redevelopment. So from 2018 to 2019, we saw an increase from $800 million to $1 billion in housing resources statewide, but this is still lagging from where we were under redevelopment with $1.2 to $1.8 billion in housing resources statewide. So it makes you wonder, what could we do with $800 million more dollars, right? With this tight squeeze on local governments, it's requiring us to push harder, dig deeper, and think a little bit more creatively on how to get housing built. So in the city of Sacramento, and I want to say there's a great team of people in the city of Sacramento that have been doing this work, and I've gotten to come on board recently, but there's been a lot of foresight put into how do we streamline housing. Most recently, we are looking at a ministerial housing ordinance. This is currently in process, and it's set to come to the city council next month. And under this process, we're kind of taking off of Senate Bill 35 that allowed for housing developments using prevailing wage to have a more streamlined process to get to development. And while a lot of housing, affordable housing, might not trigger prevailing wage depending on the funding sources, we in the city of Sacramento wanted to look at how do we streamline housing developments overall. So the city of Sacramento has created a process very similar to SB 35, but with lower thresholds to qualify for it. So housing developments of 2 to 200 units that meet certain policy and design requirements are guaranteed a 90-day review process in order to get their entitlements. So creating these opportunities for certainty does a few things. It leads more developers to be interested in developing in the city, and it provides them, more assurance of what the process is and how long it will take. In addition to these, recently the ad hoc ordinance was passed in just a few weeks ago by the city council. What the ad hoc ordinance did was look at the level of approvals and which bodies they're taken to, the planning commission and the city council. And some of the planning commissioners on their own dime had gone up to Portland, and other cities have done this and looked at how do we bring entitlement processes down to a lower level so that they can go more quickly, and so that the Planning Commission becomes more of a policy body and not just a project review or a map review or a conditional use permit review body. So recently, the city has lowered the thresholds on where some of these entitlement processes go, with the goal of trying to bring more uses and more housing online quickly. Lastly, there was a streamlining menu of options that's been discussed at the city with 50 concepts, including the 2 that I just went over, and more that I will be mentioning. But if anybody wants to see that list of all 50 concepts, happy to share that. It's more of an encouragement to just kind of sit back and brainstorm and think about what's the realm of possibilities that we can do in our city to promote housing and encourage it. So another one of those, looking at reducing cost of construction, was the city of Sacramento has adopted a $0 development impact fee for affordable housing units. These are any rental or ownership units that have a 30-year commitment to affordability, varying levels of affordability, but affordability with at least a 30-year deed restriction attached to them. This decreases the overall cost of development and incentivizes more affordable housing. That can be a big leap for a lot of cities because impact fees are bread and butter and they bring in revenue to cover our costs. So I think in acknowledgement of that, what are the other things that could be done to reduce costs? Things like going in and doing specific plans and creating processes where projects don't have to go through a huge environmental review process every time there's a new development and or a new entitlement process. So creating more certainty and reduce costs there through pre-zoning sites and doing specific plans that can streamline a process. When I worked in the city of Roseville, the downtown specific plan created the opportunity for housing to be built, and I mean apartment complexes when I say housing, to be built with less than $100 planning fee. So that's like a really cheap processing fee. So I think just looking for ways to facilitate development through the zoning process, and including looking at surplus properties. In the city of Sacramento, we've been evaluating which sites the city holds that we no longer need and we're ready to let go of, and within that, evaluating them for developability for housing, different types of housing, as well as utility connections. And then lastly, I want to mention on this slide, construction labor force is a really big challenge right now. We are competing with the Bay Area to attract individuals to build housing and all kinds of things in our area, but focused on housing here. And so the city of Sacramento has really focused on how do we link the partners to create a better track for people to get into construction workforce. They're high-paying jobs, they're well-paid jobs. There's great opportunities. There's huge demand for it. So we're trying to work with the high schools, the community colleges, and the trades and the BIA to really try to create these opportunities for kids to be more exposed to construction labor opportunities, plumbing, electricians, engineering, just across the board, doing what we can to try and lift up that labor force, because if we don't, the costs of construction are going to continue to increase. Next, I wanted to just show you a quick video that we're using at the city of Sacramento as part of our update to the general plan. And I wanted to show it because it brings up an idea around other ways to zone and incentivize housing. So I'm going to let the video go for a couple of minutes here.
Is there sound with the video?
Oh, can you not hear it?
No.
Hmm.
Can you talk through it?
Yeah, so they're talking about how there was a separation of types of housing and that played into the separation of incomes and opportunities in the community. And that even today, the majority of the zoning in the city of Sacramento, 70%, is designated toward single family homes. So as part of this policy change, I'll just switch over. Part of the policy being considered is whether we get rid of the single family zoning altogether and look more at what the real concern and question is, which is how do we ensure appropriate massing within single family or all types of neighborhoods. So instead of looking at whether the density is meeting a certain threshold, we look at whether the floor area ratio is within a percentage that makes sense to the area. So that would be the square footage on the site to the size of the lot. What this does is it gets to more inclusive neighborhoods. We can have neighborhoods where there are triplexes and duplexes and single family homes. It harkens back to actually what we see in a lot of the older neighborhoods before we had single family zoning in place. And it creates more opportunities for people throughout the community to move to high desirable areas where there's more services and education opportunities. The other piece on the creativity side is we're looking at a very wide range of housing types. I talked about earlier how the type of housing development really hasn't changed. And we in the city of Sacramento, and especially our mayor's office and city council, are really pushing out, are there better ways and faster ways to build housing in order to respond to our needs? We're doing this by looking at everything from manufactured housing, modular type housing where it's blocks that they kind of piece together on a site, tiny homes, container housing, just really trying to look at how do we reduce costs and streamline to the greatest extent possible. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight the customer service aspect. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that the best solutions come from experiences of our customers, our developers, our homeowners who are trying to build. And so out of this, with some of our Senate Bill 2 planning funding, we are putting together an accessory dwelling unit toolkit. I'm happy to be working on this with the City of Davis and Jessica and other cities in our state that are looking at how do we make the accessory dwelling unit toolkit or the process easier. So looking at stock plans that people could use over the counter. I know that that's been discussed in Davis for a while, but also looking at the process, outlining it so that there's sort of a roadmap for the person, ensuring more consistency in the process so they know what to expect, and holding an open house where people might be able to exchange ideas and contacts for contractors, having contractors there and financiers and architects and sort of all the parts of the process, city staff, so that if they have questions, they can ask those questions up front. And we're even looking at whether there's prefab unit options for this in order to help people kind of cut through that construction process more quickly and get their accessory dwelling units online. Second to this, but kind of related, is looking at master plan approvals for development throughout the city, where we've had several developers approach us and say, I want to build workforce housing. If I could create a plan that could be used multiple times, reducing cost and streamlining it for future development, I could build it in multiple places in the city with different finishes or features and colors so it looks different enough, but it would also create enough of a pipeline that we could get workforce housing without subsidy. So we at the City of Sacramento, similar to what we do with like a single family development where we have plans that get replicated, we're looking at the potential of having development that could be replicated throughout the city. And then lastly, I just think that it's important we continue to gain feedback from the development community and homeowners of accessory dwelling units that tell us how the process is going, that tell us what could have gone better, what would have helped them at the front end, and really incorporating those comments, allowing for anonymous comments to ensure that we hear all of the points of view and can incorporate it into the process. I think solutions for the provision of housing must include all stakeholders of development. So I just want to close with a thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion tonight. Thank you to the League of Women Voters and the City of Davis. I'm grateful for the foundation that the city has provided me, both the city and its residents, and I'm excited to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Danielle. We appreciate you too. All right, now for our last speaker, and that is Charles Durrett, or Chuck. He is the principal and owner of Durrett Architects, and he'll be discussing co-housing as an affordable housing option. In 1988, Catherine McCammett and Charles Durrett coined the term co-housing for a Danish concept that they learned while they were in residence in Denmark. Since that time, McCammett, who is now Co-Housing Solutions, and Durrett have worked with groups to create and design high-functioning co-housing neighborhoods in the US and Canada. Durrett Architects has designed more than 50 co-housing communities, 50+ affordable housing, and housing for homeless. And in addition, Mr. Durrett has consulted on over 150 co-housing communities. So he's also the author of several books that you can get on Amazon, and one specifically I'll mention is State-of-the-Art Co-Housing, Lessons Learned from Quimper Village, and this is a senior community, and I hope Chuck will talk about that so we can learn a little there too. So Chuck, welcome. You're on.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thanks for having us. We're happy to be here. I was hearkening back on other presentations similar that I have witnessed, I've seen, and I was thinking that, you know, I'm the sole, you know, day in and day out housing practitioner here out there, you know, at City Hall, over and over again, trying to get projects built. And I've noticed in similar presentations that the sole practitioner is often the most frustrated one. So I'm going to try not to come off as the frustrated one tonight, okay? But I will offer lots of suggestions. Okay, well, let me see. Zishi is here to make sure that I can bumble through some technology.
Well, let's see.
There we go. Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, you know, our job is designing multifamily housing, and all over the U.S. We have a project finishing today in Durham, North Carolina, the first LGBTQ co-housing community, very affordable in North Carolina, in the world that I know of. But anyway, you can tell that our work is rather innovative generally. This happens to be the co-housing where I live in. And we moved in with 37 kids and 21 seniors. It's a very mixed scene. And yet I can tell you that everything about the project was nothing but fantastic to create, except for the difficulties with the state and local laws. And for example, we had to do 5 affordable housing units. And those units ended up being the only going to the people with the most money, because they were all went to seniors, which is fine, of course, but they didn't count the assets in that calculation. They only counted the income in that calculation. And those units are by far the least popular. They stay empty the longest because, you know, real young families have to put their kids through college, and they have to worry about inevitable medical problems. So, you know, they need appreciation, and those houses don't appreciate. And So they stay empty a lot. Only those 5 units stay empty because nobody wants them. So it's kind of frustrating that the best intention sometimes goes awry. Let's see here, that guy. We did just finish a 70-unit homeless project in Napa County. It's actually in American Canyon, literally finished about 9 months ago. The units rent on the very low income of about 1/3 of people's Social Security. Most people get about $700 a month in Social Security. So the rents run just around $300 a month. And mostly homeless vets, but a lot of other homeless folks too. But again, I'll just mention that, you know, because we took $1 million in state money, we had to make the units 100% roll-in. And because we had a 56-foot drop in the site, that probably cost us about $2 million to create. So that wasn't easy. Now, of course, the state law allows for us to appeal to a hardship, and but the city of American Canyon said, no way, somebody will sue us or later. And so there probably is going to need to be some reform in the tort law that, you know, with 70 units, 30 units could have been roll-in, and these seniors would have been accommodated better and a lot less costly than it was required. Instead of the typical 7 funders that we need for a typical affordable housing project, this one had to have 16 funders to help with that affordability, largely because of that 56-foot drop in that 100% roll-in criteria. There's a lot of things on that moral plateau besides handicap accessibility. Believe me, I'm a big believer, but there's a lot of other line items, including homelessness. I mean, homelessness is looked over and over again. ADA is never looked over. I mean, I have so many bureaucrats that I know of who refer to the homeless problem as a Darwinian problem, but nobody questions the ADA question. So some of these questions are big ticket items. They're real sacred cows. And for us to get anywhere really in accommodating homelessness in the state, we're going to have to address the sacred cows. There's other things on that moral plateau, like homelessness, like global warming, that need to be addressed, and we just got to get there. But anyway, these houses turned out lovely. The house on the far left, a guy named Matt moved in, and a Vietnam vet. And during the grand opening, he looked at the audience of about 200 people, and he says, you guys know that freeway that y'all drove in here to get into town? Well, I've been sleeping under that freeway for the last 6 years, and I'm a Vietnam vet. So, you know, it really brings home, no pun intended, you know, the very dire questions that we have to address literally as fast as possible. I'm just finishing a book about this project because it's so impressive what American Canyon did here. They only got incorporated as a town about 10 years ago. And the first thing they did was buy a piece of property for $460,000, 3.5 acres, and put out a competition for 29 architect developers to build a homeless project. We happened to win. And because most of the other, well, all of the other 28 solutions were a single building, and American Canyon just didn't want, you know, to hotel these people. They wanted to create something that was very much based on the community context, and therefore co-housing. They really like the co-housing. It's not co-housing by any stretch of the imagination. It's co-housing inspired, basically. So I'm just going to walk through these because it was largely for vets. I did a token 3 soldiers in formation on the dormers there, and 1 soldier fallen on the far left. I didn't tell anybody about that until it was done, and it was appreciated. A lot of the residents are just, you know, amazing people who just fell on hard luck. And I'm not sure if she's a veteran or not. You didn't have to be a veteran. You're just homeless or a veteran. And a lot of, you know, amazing people live there. And when you're in the trenches like this and you get to know these people like I do, even when I'm not doing co-housing, I make sure and do 3 or 4 or 5, you know, construction projects on those sites at the same, like building these garden beds that, you know, gets me in touch with these people. Because I think the biggest problem is bringing the heart back to this housing problem, not making it just an academic or financial or even a policy solution. We got to bring people into it. In fact, I'm going to say a lot about that because I think what makes our projects the most affordable, we did the Nevada City co-housing for $255,000 units at a time when the average house in Nevada City was 500,000. So, and that was all a function of having the 13 school teachers at the table from day one, the 4 nurses and the bus driver and all the other people who, you know, brought it home that we have to make this project affordable so we can get these people in. This happens to be an affordable project in Sebastopol that we did. Again, it was inspired, the city council actually asked us to make it as co-housing-like as possible. And so it was very much designed to be a community so that it can be supported. This happens to be in downtown Sonoma. And if you can do a project in Sonoma that's affordable, you can do it anywhere, frankly. You can do it in Davis because they consider themselves uber discerning, and you better really have your act together when you come to town, basically. And yet it was a pleasure to work with them because their heart was in the right place, for one thing. We've been doing a lot of these shared houses. So this is a downstairs of a unit where it's kitchen, dining, living, and then upstairs is 4 suites with a mom and 1 or 2 children. So it's 10 or 12 or 14 people living in these units. And they do a lot of sharing, like shared cooking and shared childcare and things like that. That really, this project is in Morgan Hill. It's been built for about 20 years. And because we use the future residents, the Mercy Housing, who is the nonprofit developer, says it's the easiest project they have of all of them to manage. And when it comes to affordable housing projects, I think that's huge. Often a lost concept is how much they cost to manage. Sometimes you'll see 4 or 5 or 6 managers on site, and just lots of cost that goes into management. And so one of the reasons that we really appreciate working with the future residents, these single moms, when we were being hired to this project, I said to myself, you know, I'm not a single mom. I'm not going to pretend to know what they know about putting dinner on the table, picking up the kids from childcare, and all those other issues. So it made a huge difference towards, after we got it built, towards them being able to do a lion's share of the management themselves. Now, we had the Assistant Secretary of HUD at the grand opening and the local congresswoman, and I told them that we involved the future residents, which is patently frowned upon because theoretically that could be considered preferential housing and not the typical lottery system. But both of them said at that time that that's the way it should be done. And we have to grow towards getting people involved in the creation of their own neighborhoods, because there's so much ownership that comes to the table in those settings that people, you know, it becomes a lot different product, frankly. And I'm sorry, this slide doesn't read very well, but there's a couple houses that I'm doing locally here that are for 4 households for elderly people. So there are 4 to 8 people going to live there. And we've been rehabbing factories for a long time. This one's in the Bay Area. We took a 1-story factory and made it into 12 houses. It's a wonderful little place. And again, the future residents were involved from day one. And we're motivated to not just make warehousing or just housing. There's the whole housing first concept, even with homeless projects. And my theory is community first and housing will follow, because our MO for affordable housing is everybody at the table here. This is if whatever you can afford, that's what we're going to do. When we did Berkeley co-housing, we had 4 single moms start that project at a time when the average house in Berkeley, 1995, was 500,000, and we had to make 4 houses for 130,000, and we did it because that was who was at the table. So it's a whole nother kind of concept there. And this happens to be a new project in Port Townsend, Washington. Again, the future residents are a big part of making it happen. We had quite a number of people involved who, if the house price went over by a penny, they couldn't be involved. It's amazing how motivated the contractors, the project managers, everybody got when it was clear that Susan wouldn't be able to move in if this project goes over a penny, because we had a letter from them. Most of our project, like the one we did in Davis, California, 23 out of 26 of them were first-time homebuyers. So we have to get super serious about meeting those budgets. And it's a lovely little community now, very simple, single floor cottages. And, but the community there is very palpable, and that's what matters. I mean, the mantra in our office is, if it doesn't work socially, why bother? Of course, we have to keep the rain off people's heads, and we get that. But it's all easier when people know each other, care about each other, and support each other. Cotati, California, 50 miles north of San Francisco. I think we had 19 school teachers involved with this project. That year, 2002, there was, 2004. 2004, there were 1.6 million houses built in the US, and these guys got Neighborhood of the Year that year by NAHAB. And it's very dead clear to me how come they got Neighborhood of the Year. Look at this cast of characters who made their neighborhood. They said, you know, being able to borrow a cup of sugar from my next door neighbor is paramount to my quality of life. Being able to ask a neighbor to watch my kid while I run off to the grocery store, etc., is paramount to me. And those were the goals put on the table, you know, in 12 full days of co-designing this project with the neighbors. Just finished a project in Vancouver, BC, where the average house price was $778,000 when we bought this, when we started this project. This project, like a lot of projects that we're doing right now, this group bought, I actually went up to Vancouver and found them a site, which was very difficult. So we ended up finding 2 single-family houses next to each other for sale, and bought those, and then did away with the subdivision, 0.6 acres, turned it into 31 units. We have more and more projects that are single-family house to 30 units. That can only happen in co-housing. But this project was started by a 29-year-old woman who was a physical therapist. 100% of her patients were infants and toddlers who were brain damaged by their parents, shaker babies. And she said, when I come home, I need support. And therefore, she started this project. She managed with a lot of help to buy a 4-bedroom house, which she rents one. She owns the house, and she has 3 renters. So it serves her, and it serves 3 other millennials, actually, who otherwise have a hard time buying a house, or getting into housing. And this is that community now. So it's a stellar place, actually. You know, with a wide variety. The thing about co-housing is that we invariably have units that cost $150,000, and we have units that cost $500,000 in the same neighborhood. That's typical in co-housing. We actually need the $500,000 units to subsidize the $150,000 units. And people will get willing to do it when they know each other and care about each other. This happens to be in Mountain View, California, where we took another single family house, had it rezoned to 19 units for seniors, it worked out great. This happens to be where I live, Nevada City, California, Nevada City co-housing. As I mentioned, we moved in with 37 kids. It's very alive there. And I just miss the 7 o'clock drumming that we do every night, because everybody's locked in place. So we do a little hello and good night at 7 o'clock. As I mentioned, the unit started at 255, and I'm a big fan. I'm promoting around the country these days the notion that we put a voluntary cap on our appreciation. Different co-housing around the country have been doing that. Berkeley did. That's, you know, Berkeley's a very ideological group, ideological place. They have a 4% cap on their appreciation every year. It's very effective in keeping those units affordable. However, the funny thing about that project is nobody has moved out since 1995, because it's such a, you know, you couldn't buy another house in Berkeley with that kind of money, and you know, people want to live there. As I mentioned, I'm not interested in just making real estate. If it doesn't work socially, why bother? And this connection really makes a difference. I was having dinner at a co-housing community recently, and a guy, 77-year-old guy named Butch, was telling me how for 20 years in the single family house that he lived in, he was buying 5 to 6 tanks of gas a month, and now he buys less than 1 tank of gas a month in the last 5 years. So co-housing is a, you know, a cultural phenomena, very much like old-time villages, where people manage to accommodate a lot more of their daily activities by proximity because you know the people and care about the people that live around you. We have a 1.5 acre farm that we use, profusely, plus several other gardens, and a lot of co-housing do it. The interesting thing about it is we have a couple of farmers who moved in, and now it's infectious. Now there's all these people who are a lot of wannabe farmers now.
Chuck, can you explain or define co-housing? How is
yeah, thank you.
People are asking that question.
Okay, I kind of jumped to it. Well,
Yeah.
there's 6 definitions, and if you really want to drill down, you want to get a copy of the book called Creating Co-housing. It really lays it out, but there's 6 pieces of the definition. Number 1 is all of these parents here were involved with the creation of this neighborhood so that they could, best assure that their kids could walk outside their front door and be with other kids. And I just want to, I need to commingle why the participation, because it seems to be the number one thing in our culture that gets shied away from. Interestingly enough, this woman, this young lady on the right, Genevieve, her father helped start the Davis co-housing, the very first one that we did in Davis. Anyway, and by the way, that happens to be a fire lane that they're sitting in, but it doesn't feel like a fire lane. None of it feels like suburban, brand X for sure, because again, when you have future residents. 2 is that there's extensive common facilities. We have dinner in our common house 4 or 5 times a week available. 3 is it's 100% self-managed. And 4, it's designed to facilitate community. 5, there's no commingling of economics. And 6, there's no hierarchy. Again, it's all in the book. And we've added the last 2 on there because people wanted to make it think, oh my God, if these people are doing these things via participation, there must be some hierarchy. The funny thing is that project I showed in Cotati, it was surrounded by 3 other projects at the very same time that we were building ours. Ours took 3 years. 2 nonprofit projects, they took 5 years and 5 years. And 1 for-profit project, it took 7 years. So people often think, there's a lot of misnomers about co-housing or misconceptions. One is that it will take longer. We spend like 12 days in the participatory design process, but then you have so much ownership. These people really care that when you have a hearing at City Hall, they're there explaining why they have a fire lane going through their project instead of a street, et cetera, et cetera. And all, it's so many details that can trip up a project, whether it's fire access or handicap access or, there's thousands. The building code, when I did my first house in Nevada City in 1976, was about 1 inch thick. Now it's 10,000 pages. So there's so many possibilities of tripping it up. And you need real people from a real subculture to help give the bureaucrats context. This is real housing for real people. So let's not, let's be creative. In fact, I'm really looking forward to the times when I come to a city and say, hey, I want to do a multifamily housing project. And they say, what can we do to help you? It's just not the norm. It's just not the norm. Here's 15 reasons that you can't do what you want to do right out of the bat every time, basically. And so we have to, it's an uphill battle every time. This is a 3-story building that we turned into a 5-story building in downtown Oakland. It was a phone switching station built in 1921. Like I said, we're doing more and more of those. And this is for nonprofit Catholic charities who, again, really wanted their place to function like a community. So we went into that project already built and did a bunch of community building exercises and resident organizing. It made a huge difference in the success of that project. And I know how many of these projects where we can rate the connection between people before we do the workshop and the rate connection between people after we do the workshop, and it's night and day. The common house was never used before we did the workshop, for example. Now, whenever I go there, there's always people there. Lovely little studio units, and really an important project, I think. We're doing.
I was just saying, Chuck, we're getting a little bit long, and I'd like to be able to ask some of the questions that we have from our.
We are.
Yeah. So
okay.
Wrap up in a couple minutes here.
Yep, we're doing a lot of projects based on making it feel like housing. This is a 24-unit project for moms and children coming out of abused households. I'll just put that in. A homeless, 5-story homeless project in San Francisco. They have dinner together 6 nights a week. Berkeley co-housing, I could talk all day about that project. Here's what this is a slide I really want to get to. This is buying that single family house on the far right. 90-year-old guy died there, having it rezoned to 24 units. Rolling up our sleeves. This woman on the far right could only afford $150,000. We had to do 6 houses, brand new houses for $150,000. And it's a very cultural act, and it's a very lovely place. The key code in Davis, in my opinion, and this is the code that we have to implement in every single neighborhood that we go to, is no matter what your 2-inch zoning book says, we always have to rely on this paragraph, which is, if we have a better idea, this is what we want to propose. And that's the most important, as far as I'm concerned, paragraph in every zoning code. And it should be employed a lot more, because, you know, single family zoning, of course, I'll have you do a single family house. No, we want to do 24 houses. And it's a better idea for all these reasons. Hey, let me just show the next slide, because it's got the website. And then I'm done.
Thank you.
The real secret ingredient is the people, though.
Yeah, it always is. Doesn't matter what you do. It's always the people.
Amen, sister. Okay, I'm happy for whatever questions you have.
Oh, okay. Well, you explained that. Okay, so let me go through some of the questions that we have here. First question, anonymous. Can a city like Davis, that has lots of expensive housing, decide to zone only for affordable housing and not add pricier housing? Okay, so probably Danielle and Jessica can help with that. Maybe Greg.
Yeah.
Too.
I can start and anybody else can jump in. So you can credit up. So if you do more low income units or moderate income units than required, you can credit it up towards the next income level. So you do get credit. If you did all very low income units, let's just say, you could credit it all the way up the income chain. I mean, I think ideally the state is looking for a mix of housing types, but I think communities also have some flexibility in how they meet that, as long as they're within at or below that income range.
Okay, how about, are there any cities or counties that still have an exemption from RHNA requirements due to special status designated by legislature, for instance? Greg, that sounds like that's right up your lane.
Yeah, I don't know if Marin still has that in place. I know legislators were saying, why does Marin get an exemption? This is something that happened years ago. I didn't follow what actually came out of it, but legislators were asking that question. There are exemptions in Marin, and then there's kind of specialty exemptions for the LA area. But Marin, I think, has been the biggest target. So I don't know the answer.
Okay. Well, this would be for Jessica. And what is the City of Davis doing to encourage ADUs?
So we are, I am working with Danielle on the ADU toolkit that she had mentioned. We also received some funding from the Senate Bill 2 grant. We've got more grant money coming, so there's a possibility we can add some of that. But like Danielle mentioned, that includes the over-the-counter pre-prepared plans. We're looking to streamline our process, and basically the idea would be that if you want to provide and do an ADU on your property, you can come to the city, and for a reasonable fee that would be much less than anything else, you could just hand the city a check for much less than what it would cost you normally, and we just give you pick a plan that's from this pre-approved book. We've already vetted it through the building department, planning commission, the city council, and you can just go get someone to construct it and you're done. So that it removes that discretionary part from that. We are also going to be updating our ADU ordinance so that we are in compliance with the 2019 legislation. And I guess I should mention the 2019 legislation, not just affecting the City of Davis, but it adds a lot of extra ways that you can do ADUs. You can theoretically put 2 ADUs and a junior ADU on your property. It has reduced setback requirements, reduced development impact fee requirements. So the idea is it's supposed to make it a lot easier for you to, a lot cheaper and a lot easier for you to go through. So we will be bringing our ordinance up to code, up to
Today.
up with that. Yeah. And then we'll probably include a pretty good program in the housing element to address that.
So a question for Chuck. Talk a little bit, if you will, about the cap appreciation. So with regards to your co-housing, there's a buy-in. You talked a little bit about that, cap on appreciation. Maybe can you talk about that a little bit? Be a little bit more explicit, if you will, about sort of the financial piece of it.
Yeah, there's a number of co-housing projects that are capping their appreciation nationwide. Berkeley's the best well-known at 4% a year. And basically they agreed, you know, before they moved in that they would do that. It wasn't all ideological. That was the first project, I think it was 30 years, that was previously rental, although it was 100% abandoned, and turning a rental project into an ownership project, which happened to be almost all people who had previously renting in Berkeley and now wanted to own in Berkeley. Most of them had children, and you know, we're just tired of you know, the whims of the landlord. So they wanted to own, and for the city to accept that, they had to accept a cap. So they did, and it worked out fine.
Okay. Let's see here. I know we're getting a little bit.
Can I add one thing to that, Georgina?
Sure.
In the city of Davis, there are units with appreciation caps. So just to point out for the audience, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, but Aggie Village has a cap based on consumer price index and or changes in the salaries of the teachers, since that's part of, or the professors, since it's part of the UC Davis system. And then there's the condominium project, Southfield Terrace on Green Terrace, Southfield Park, excuse me, that has had a 5.5% appreciation cap since the early 90s. And then in some iterations of the affordable housing ordinance, there were caps placed on units built in more recent times of 3.75%. And that was looking at the average change in income, which is usually about 3%, plus about 0.75% for an acknowledgement of reinvestment into the unit.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here's another question. Greg Chu, this might be for you. What if you run out of land to zone, meaning you get outside the city boundaries now? What happens with RHNA and the city's requirements? What happens then?
So this is an issue, as I showed in my slides, the LA area, they got a triple number from their prior round. A lot of these jurisdictions don't have much vacant land, and they're surrounded by other jurisdictions. So the intent of the legislature is to force more increased infill development and increased densities. And that's what that's the intent of where a lot of jurisdictions are going towards. So it's real estate economics. There's just a lot of demand for housing in general. The trickle down theory is that jurisdictions would find ways to do that if they can't find adjacent lands to annex.
So meaning they'll go up. Is that
they'll go up, and they'll you know, the big issue here that the legislature is addressing, as talked about earlier, is the amount of land that we have zoned in the state that's residential. The vast majority of it is single family housing. In our region, more than 90% of the Sacramento area residential lands are single family housing. And the intent of the legislative laws that recently passed is to try to find more ways to get more multifamily zoned. And that's the reason why the LA area got such a large number for their RHNA.
Okay. So let me see if I can kind of paraphrase this question. This will be for the panel, but I think Chuck, a little bit for you too. So we have a project here in town that is going to be for the community's working on it, if you will. And they're asking the question about low and very low income developments seem to be the most difficult. And how do we get to that? How do we, provide for those folks and that, income level? So I don't know, maybe Chuck, you can start.
I'm happy to start. And I want to mention the land thing. People do think that land is a fixed cost. It's definitely not. My highest and best use these days is going to different towns and helping them find a piece of land. I just came back from Flagstaff and I found them 9 different sites to make an offer on. They've been looking for a piece of land to do an affordable housing project on for 4 years. But anyway, if you know what you're looking for, it's pretty fast. You can do it pretty quickly. And just make an offer to all 9 of those sites and make that offer half of what you think the market would bear, because you're always going to be surprised somebody is going to want to do it. I mean, it's like, donate your car for the radio station. Well, donate your land that you don't need and you have too much money already to an affordable housing project. And you would be surprised how many people are motivated to do the right thing. A lot of people are. All they need is the ask. I worked in Denmark for 2 years, and I was surprised how often the county government was making offers on private pieces of property so that they could get affordable housing built. And they had people just rolling around looking for private pieces of property near a transit station and where they thought it would be a good site, making an offer and walking away. So what? It's half of what the market would bear. You'd be surprised if only one out of 20 of those people accept the property, you're off to the races. So, the interesting thing about affordable housing, it's hard to find the silver bullet. People go, oh, tiny houses or whatever the issue du jour is, whatever the flavor du jour is. There's a woman here yesterday that was telling me in Nevada County, she rents a single family, she rents a tiny house, 8.5 feet by 13 feet for $1,000 a month. It has no running water, etc. The market will decide what the rents are going to be, not the construction type. She can get a 1-bedroom apartment with a kitchen and a dining room, etc., for less than $1,000 a month here. And it would be nice if the tiny house solution would help, but it doesn't. And in a way, it creates more sprawl because you can't have those units next to each other. There's lots of complications with that kind of land use, basically. I think the better idea is for the government to get involved, participate in buying pieces of property, participating in flipping them to nonprofits and to people like co-housing groups. In Denmark, they seek out co-housing groups to flip the land to because they know they're going to make a great neighborhood, and they're usually low to moderate income people.
Interesting. Anybody else have any comments? Not okay.
I think the only thing I would add is that, and those were great points, and that as part of the surplus property, doing the inventory and the process, cities are expected to first prioritize surplus property for affordable housing and go through a whole process to make sure it's publicized and noticed to all potential developers. So we are definitely working on, thank you and point taken, Chuck, we are definitely trying to get our surplus properties to affordable housing as much as we can.
Well, thank you, Danielle.
All right, well, we're getting long here, and I appreciate everybody hanging with me. Let's ask one more question. Let's see if I can kind of paraphrase this. Are ADUs, as far as, meeting affordable housing requirements, are they really going to help us get there, one? And aren't they, or are they more susceptible to sort of inequitable housing practices? So.
I might start off by saying that you mentioned, Chuck had mentioned the thing du jour, and I think that's what the legislators legislature is seeing ADUs as the silver bullet right now, and that's what the legislation is reflecting. I do think that those of us in housing do see it as it's part of the solution, and it's great that the state is allowing us to take credit toward our housing obligations for those types of units. And it is a great way for people who do own properties to develop places for multi-generational housing where they can rent to people, and it's kind of taking control of the landlord. You're the landlord of your own place to provide affordable housing, as opposed to these huge housing developments. However, it's definitely not the only solution. So we will have to push back at the state and at the city level to get them to see that there are different things that are needed. So it's part of the solution. It's definitely not all of it.
I think
Let's add to that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Greg.
Just really quickly. So ADUs, yes, is only part of the solution. There's many other housing products that would work. There's a term called missing middle that's very popular. Those are for the housing types that fit into single family residential areas that are multifamily. It could be duplexes, cottage apartments, carriage houses, etc. Those we went away from after the Second World War, and now they're back in vogue. And they're things that communities with single family housing, those are more accessible, and ADUs are part of that. It's things that people are willing to do that don't make a big they don't perceive as a big sacrifice. It's only part of the problem. You know, there's all sorts of different affordable housing products that we could do, but not everybody's going to want higher density apartment complexes in their single family residential area. So it's as much a political issue as anything.
Yeah, they're easier to wedge in to single family neighborhoods.
So two more questions if I can. One's going to go to Chuck specifically. So I came out of the home building industry, and I am surprised, I bet the other panelists are too, that you're able to bring a large group of people together. Let's say some of your communities you're saying are 45 homes or units. That's a large number of people to bring together to try and find consensus and to get qualified and to come into design. And, you know, how do you do it? Just briefly, not too long.
Okay. Are you saying something long-winded or something?
No, I didn't mean it quite that way. We're just going long on time.
Actually, it is a lengthy topic. I went to Denmark for 6 months to learn how to do that. And I realized I didn't know how to do it after 6 months. And I stayed 13 months learning from the best of the best in the world. But here's what I'll say. You know, in my, history, I've designed a lot of single family houses. Even though, as far as I'm concerned, we don't need another single family house ever. But, and I'll tell you, these co-housing projects are a lot easier to design than single family houses, where you get a mom and a dad tyrannizing each other, and beating each other up throughout the whole project. What I find, co-housing math is 1 + 1 = 3. I have an idea, you have an idea, and the third idea that we come up with together is better. And when a group starts to see that day after day, they go, okay, I'm in the right place, and I want to figure out how to be part of this solution, not part of, a more intransigent rear view mirror, it's all about me. The shortest poem in the English language is me, we. And anytime you look at the interpretation of that poem, it always comes back to, my life is better if our life is better. And that's got to be the mantra for, affordable housing, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. So the last question, and I think this is, it's an interesting issue, and, I'll pose it for all of you. One of our attendees has asked it. So, there's been some housing dollars that were provided so that cities could, for instance, put homeless in hotels. We've been able to do that here in Davis, and I think it's marvelous. It's a wonderful thing. But it's a short-term solution, and short-term's good. We got to have short-term solutions and long-term solutions. But what will happen then? What do we have? I'm sure Sacramento has some ideas. We're probably working on some ideas, but what are those things that we can do so we don't just say, okay, I know you were in a nice hotel, but now we don't have anywhere to put you. What do we do? Can you talk about that? Maybe Jessica, do you want to start?
Sure. That is a very good question. And I think that the city is struggling with that. We do have a few projects in the pipeline that are hoping to provide for a more permanent housing. Paul's Place on H Street comes to mind as one that is in coming up to the Planning Commission and City Council in the very near future. So that those are a few, but it is something that I know that we are working on. Kelly Stakowitz, our assistant city manager, is highly involved in those types of projects. I'd have to probably defer to her on anything other than Paul's Place, but as far as the planning entitlements, that's the one project that I do know of that's got a shot. Actually, I think it was just at hearing, but that's got a shot to happen relatively quickly. And I think that is a total of, I want to say 18 permanent units plus some supportive and emergency transitional beds as well. So more projects like that, but they are very difficult to get through for a number of reasons.
Okay, all right. Danielle, do you have anything that maybe you can offer along that line that Sacramento is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the rehousing plan that you mentioned in my intro. It's a challenge. It's a huge challenge, especially bringing things online quickly. I will say that the state is looking at putting some of its COVID relief funds from the federal government towards acquisition and rehab of motels so that local cities can decide if they want to do a long-term solution through motels. But in the meantime, we are all trying to figure out where can we put more transitional housing, short-term options that can come online fast. I will also acknowledge, and Greg, I'm sure knows this, because Mutual just got funded for the 5th Street project, which started while I was still there. So it's exciting that that'll be under construction. Of course, I mean, the challenge is construction takes time. So those won't be ready until long past, hopefully long past all of the COVID response. So we are looking in Sacramento at things like the motel acquisition fund. We are also looking at transitional options, manufactured units. We're looking at, do we buy a number of manufactured homes and put them on city surplus properties, or put them on properties that are held by nonprofits or other partners like Chuck was talking about, who want to offer land for the purpose of homelessness and housing. So it's pushing some creativity and asking us to think about, you know, how do we do more with less? And this is always the challenge with local government, but that's what makes our job so fun.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you to everybody. We've run over, so I really appreciate your staying with us, and our audience out there for staying with us too. And I mean, a really important discussion, and we'll make this video available to you know, the attendees and anybody else that has some interest in it. And you know, all I can say is thank you. It's, you know, housing is not, it's complicated. It's not an easy topic, and it really takes everybody. And I really feel like this public and a private partnership needs to happen more and more. And maybe Chuck needs to do all the charrettes to get everybody to say, you know, to get them in the right direction, right?
That's right. Come and sell that so that we can get some programs in the housing element.
There you go. Okay, any closing comments?
I just want to say, you had mentioned before that you were going to provide me with the contact information for everyone. So if everyone's interested in that, I can certainly put you on our notification list for the housing element outreach process.
Okay, very good. And we will get that information to you. All right, everybody, good night. And thank you so much. Really.
Thank you.
Very, very much. It was quite fun. See ya.
Bye.